Oi, focus here, focus here. And we are your hosts, Mr. Warren Slong
and Mr. Multiplier.
and welcome back to another episode of
Choose That Policy!
In mid-March, many provincial governments began to distribute vouchers to households to cover expenditures on specific items. As such, this will increase purchasing power and hence the ability to consume goods and services, boosting consumption. An increase in consumption will lead to an increase in aggregate demand, and hence, by the multiplier effect, we will observe an increase in real national income.
Yo, that policy is pretty cool. It sounds kind of like a Singapore Rediscover vouchers.
Yeah, actually, I think we implemented a similar policy before, and the effect should be around the same, right?
Well, just to give you guys some Mr. Multiplier insights, this policy may actually be more effective than you think. Because the user's consumption multiplier actually stands at 1.38, but with the borders closed, the multiplier value actually goes up to 1.97, closer to the tourism multiplier, but would not be the most effective in the long run. And that's because people may not consistently visit our local tourist attractions. The marginal utility derived from traveling overseas may actually be higher because of the visits to the new destination than the visiting of the local attractions.
Oh, and also I realized our domestic consumption will only make up 1/4 of our AD, and thus we should focus our efforts on other policies such as boosting our export competitiveness to really boost our economy. Don't you think so?
Yeah, that's right.
Alright, now moving on to China's mixed policy.
Also in mid-March, the central bank cut required reserve ratio for certain banks, freeing up renminbi 500 billion in liquidity, which banks were directed to use to increase loans to micro and small firms. Which lower required reserves, there will be more excess reserves to loan out the money to another individual. The individual can then deposit in another bank. As the cycle continues, the total demand deposits that is part of M1 has been increased and hence increased money supply. An increase in money supply will lead to a fall in interest rates, which will therefore lead to lower costs of borrowing for investments. This can lead to greater developments in the industrial sector and lead to greater output. By the production function, an increase in capital will lead to an increase in real national output and economic growth.
Actually, Mr. Multiplier, this policy sounds a lot like interest rate policy. Are you sure Singapore can do that?
Well, you may be right. Singapore may not actually be able to control interest rates for multiple reasons. If Singapore does try to lower interest rates, what eventually happens due to free capital mobility in your country is that there will be a huge outflow of hard money from Singapore to other countries, resulting in a depreciation of the Singapore dollar. And therefore, you will lose your ability to actually control interest rates, which is something really important to your country considering your export dependence. And because of the Mundell-Fleming's trilemma, where you have to choose between exchange rates, interest rates, as well as free capital mobility, interest rates policy may not actually be the wisest course of action for Singapore. But if let's say we do control interest rates, what do you think will happen?
So for argument's sake, right, if we do implement this policy, I don't think it will work actually. I got some insight from a voice at the MAS who told me that last year there was a 21% year-on-year increase in M1 from March to August. This is due to an increase in demand deposits. In fact, the Straits Times told me that last year our interest rates reached all-time lows with just 2 basis points above zero. This would cause us to end up in a liquidity trap where changing the money supply will not even affect interest rates.
Well, that sounds like terrible policy. Boo to this policy! Boo to this policy!
This economy plays a crucial role in the region and the world, be it the privacy of the banking system, the high returns on investment given the low relative inflation rates, or the low levels of financial risk. Switzerland is an ideal destination for foreign funds. This unique position creates a COVID challenge unseen in any other country, a great appreciation of the currency. There are two main causes for this. Firstly, increasing financial uncertainty in other countries triggers investors to store their funds in a safer place, while fluctuations in neighboring countries' capital markets and rapidly changing economic policies create uncertainties in whether funds will retain their value. To ensure stable returns, investors will shift their assets to Switzerland. This causes the currency to appreciate drastically. Secondly, in order to stimulate borrowing and lending, central banks around the world are lowering their interest rates. For example, the European Central Banks, with its nominal interest rate already at negative 0.5, conducted 3 rounds of quantitative easing, totaling 1.5 trillion euros under the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program. With interest rates so low, the rate of return on investment falls, such that investors search elsewhere to store their funds. Seeking higher interest rates, they will switch their foreign bonds to Swiss bonds, further appreciating the currency. To curb the appreciation, the Swiss National Bank, or the SNB, implements 2 policies. Firstly, it buys foreign currency and sells Swiss francs, decreasing the demand and increasing the supply of the franc in the forex market. This directly slows down appreciation. In order to tackle the inflow of funds due to the difference in interest rates, the SNB also tried lowering the interest rates to match those of other countries. As of May 2020, the overnight rate stood at minus 0.75%. Without higher interest rates, investors will no longer shift their funds to reap higher returns in Switzerland, slowing down appreciation. This exemplifies how Switzerland chooses to let go of its independent monetary policy. In order to keep its exchange rate stable while maintaining free capital flows, its answer to the Mundell-Fleming trilemma, however, necessitates central bank to pay firms and households to borrow money in a climate of low interest rates around the world.
Oh, Mr. Multiplier, what do you think about this policy?
Well, the Swiss government is using the good old exchange rate monetary policy. Now, this is something Mr. Multiply is exceptionally interested in because in recent times, the Swiss franc has actually been appreciating because of the surge in demand for their currency due to the slightly higher relative interest rates of the Swiss. And so this has caused the government to actually increase supply of the currency into the forex market. And this has resulted in a slower appreciation of the Swiss currency. And this is actually particularly relevant to Singapore because
Of our open capital flows and exchange rate control?
that's right, especially because Singapore has high export dependence as well as a small population. So a slower appreciation or even depreciation of Singapore's exchange rate would actually lead to an increase in Singapore's export competitiveness, specifically the price competitiveness, because of a drop in relative price levels of Singapore's goods. And so this would result in an increase in the aggregate demand to a certain extent, and this increase in AD depends on the price elasticity of demand of Singapore's exports. And fortunately for you, Singapore's price elasticity for the various exports are actually relatively high, especially for the high value added goods. And so this will lead to a more than proportionate increase in quantity demanded when the Singapore dollar depreciates. And on top of that, the price of imports actually goes up as well. And this results in an increase in net export values. And with that, all of this accumulate together to result in an increase in RNY, real national income, as well as GDP.
Yo, that sounds like an almost perfect policy. But how sustainable is this in the long run? Wouldn't depreciation lead to imported inflation, which would increase our cost of production and decrease our aggregate supply?
Well, that's right. In the long run, it would. And that's why depreciation only serves as a sustainable short-term policy. And in the long term, you're going to have to look for different policies to deal with the macroeconomic goals.
Then what about the negative interest rates?
Well, we can start talking about interest rates when Singapore is ready to control interest rates and when your neighboring countries, neighboring friends, have negative interest rates.
Oh, we'll see about that. And that does it for today's episode of Choose That Policy.
And to the NEFMC organizing team and everybody else watching this, if you'd like to see a future episode of Choose That Policy, do vote for us and let us into the next round.
And we'll see you at the next episode of Choose That Policy.